This is the official We Own This City podcast from HBO and Pineapple Street Studios. I'm D. Watkins, the host of this podcast and writer on HBO's We Own This City, a series from George Pelecanos and David Simon on corruption and abuse within the Baltimore Police Department.
This is what it's come to, Sean. You guys have locked up and beat on so many people, we can't get 12 in a box who are willing to trust what a cop says.
On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by journalist Baynard Woods and Dagmara Domińczyk, who plays FBI agent Erika Jensen. Episode 4 was tough for me to watch because of the tragic story of Umar Burley. I remember covering the trial of Sergeant Wayne Jenkins and going to his sentencing, where I watched him cry like a dump cheerleader on prom night, pleading his case to Judge Catherine Blake and apologizing to the children of Albert Davis with Tony Award-winning type of theatrics. This guy is so full of shit, I thought. He'd probably trade his own mother if it meant avoiding accountability. Jenkins had intel on Burley being a monster, slang he used for big-time drug dealers ripe for police robbery. He ran up on Burley with his gun drawn. Burley, who was in the car with Brent Matthews, didn't know Jenkins was a cop, so he pulled off and crashed into a Chevy Monte Carlo driven by 86-year-old Albert Davis, the father of a city police officer. As a result, Davis died of a heart attack. Jenkins and his crew checked the car and found nothing. So Jenkins and his accomplices planted 32 individually wrapped packages of heroin, each weighing 1 gram, sending Burley and Matthews off to prison. Burley ended up being sentenced to 15 years, while Matthews caught 3 years and 10 months. Matthews did his time and came home, while Burley stayed behind bars until Jenkins was indicted. Lawyers began digging through all of Jenkins's old cases, many of which were instantly overturned, including Burley's. The charges against him were vacated. What viewers of We Own This City probably don't know is how being locked up for something he didn't do impacted Burley's mental health. "My life will never be the same," Burley said in an interview after being released. "I have to carry on the burden of Mr. Davis's death. I've been diagnosed with PTSD because of this incident. I have to carry on a $2 million lawsuit that the Davises have over me that's preventing me from getting credit and a job. I have to carry on an unknown burden of not being the person that I once was. I'm just a shell of the person I once was. I want my life back, and I know I can't get it back. I can't get my years back." Burley and Matthews sued the city and were awarded an $8 million settlement. Shortly after, about $1 million of their settlement money hit Burley's bank account, he and his girlfriend moved out of Baltimore because rumors were spreading about gang members kidnapping him and trying to extort him out of his money. A few days later, Burley, his girlfriend, and their dogs were on the road in rural Virginia. Allegedly, Burley thought his girlfriend was also trying to steal his money. They had an altercation, which led to him shooting her and leading police officers on a high-speed chase. As a result, Burley is now back in prison. What does a person have to go through to receive $1 million in their checking account one day and allegedly shoot the person they plan on spending their life with shortly after? I'm no expert, but I will say being forced to kill an innocent man and then being falsely present definitely has something to do with it. This is why the story of the impact Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force had on thousands of lives must be told. Before we get to Baynard Woods and Dagmara Domińczyk, I want to hear from the executive producers and writers of We Own This City, George Pelecanos and David Simon, on some of their thoughts on this episode.
Everybody pretty much knows what happened to Freddie Gray. He was arrested and they found a knife on him. So they put him in the van and they gave him a rough ride. And he died in the van. The state prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, charged not just the guys who gave him the ride, but the ones who arrested them, the guys who showed up on their bikes. In the opinion of many, she overcharged them, meaning, she charged them with things like manslaughter, depraved heart murder, and all this stuff. But the result was that because she overprosecuted them and because she was never going to get those convictions, those police officers are still in the department working on the BPD. The goal should have been to get them off the street, but it went the opposite way. And then the uprising that followed that was unprecedented. I would say not since 1968 was there a city riot where there was so much violence and outrage, looting, burning, everything. And it died out as these things tend to do after a couple days. But there was a national audience for it, and it became part of the narrative of the BLM movement. It was a addendum to so many stories over the past few years that have changed the national consciousness with regards to policing in America.
I believe there was a fundamental neglect case. You ride a guy around for 45 minutes in the back of your wagon. I don't care how he got injured. It's irrelevant. The fact is he was injured in the back of that van, and people in the police department rode him around for 45 minutes without delivering him to medical care. And they have a custodial responsibility, and that is pure negligence. And those cops not only were not convicted of that, they were not charged administratively after they were acquitted in court. But they were also charged with second-degree murder, a couple of them were. And that was a reach, and that was something that a judge was going to throw right out. So other cops looked at that and said, wait a sec, you're going to charge me criminally if I try to make an arrest that I think is good? If I'm trying to make an honest arrest? Fine, I'm not getting out of my cars. That led to the police who would still get out of their cars, the Jenkinses, the Herzls, the worst sons of bitches in the department, the guys who were stealing. They looked like they were even more heroic because they had no regard for the work stoppage. They could go to their bosses and say, hey, I'm still policing. I don't know what these other guys are worried about. I'm on the streets. I'm doing my job. And in a time of a work slowdown, they looked even more essential to their commanders. So it even compounded the disaster.
There's probably no greater illustration of the dichotomy of Wayne Jenkins than his actions during the Freddie Gray riots. On the one hand, he jumped right in with both feet. He commandeered a van. He went out to where they were staging injured police, and they were helping people out there by Druid Hill Park, and he went and got fried chicken and coffee, and he spent his own money on that, and he delivered all his food to the cops. He went to the front lines. He was a hero cop. And then that very night, he goes to a Rite Aid, and he goes in and he takes a bunch of drugs. He caught some looters in there, and they ran away, so he took those drugs, and he went in and he got more. And he shows up at his friend's house, Donald Stepp, and he delivers the drugs the next morning to him, and Donald Stepp ends up offing those drugs. So you've got both sides of Jenkins during the Freddie Gray riots. But to the people in the department, he was a straight-up hero.
My next guest is actress Dagmara Domińczyk, whose credits include Succession, The Deuce, and The Lost Daughter. In We Own This City, she plays Erika Jensen, an FBI agent who conducts a federal investigation into the corrupt gun trace task force. Welcome to the show, Dag. How you feeling?
I'm feeling good, D. How are you feeling?
Happy to be talking to you and super curious to learn about your time in Baltimore and what drew you to this particular project.
Sometimes when you're an actor, a project comes along that speaks to you as a human being, and you think, oh shit, I have a chance to actually work on something that I have personal feelings about that matter to me. It's rare for that to happen, but this was the case with We Own This City on many levels. I love the people that were setting out to tell this story. I was a little nervous about playing an FBI agent because the first thing I thought was like, well, don't they have to be fit? Fuck, because I'm not very athletic. And then I thought, oh shit, is she from Baltimore? Because I can do a good British accent, but I don't know. That was one of my first questions. And they were like, no, Erika's from New York. Score.
So you had said that one of the things that drew you to the project was some personal feelings. You care to share what some of those feelings are?
Sure. I came to the US when I was 7 as an immigrant, right? My parents were like political refugees. My dad was involved in Poland in the late 70s and early 80s in this movement called Solidarity, which is working class people trying to basically overthrow the communist regime. And cops weren't cops back then. They were called militia, right? Which means militia. They were like homegrown Poles who decided to side with the communist regime. And so they broke into our apartment and they took my father away. I remember that. He was in prison for a year and then we were deported. So while I came here and I grew up looking the part of a white American with all the advantages that comes with, I didn't feel like this was my home. I felt other inside. My parents experienced not racial bias because they looked, like I said, we looked the part, but definitely discrimination. We were working class. We grew up in housing projects and cops were always bad guys to me. I was scared of them. So I've experienced, or I come from a place where oppression, right, is a through line in Polish history. And I mean, look what's going on with Ukraine now. I can't compare the two, the oppression Black people feel in this country, because I've never walked in those shoes and I won't pretend I have. The idea of people in power corrupting and holding back the people who are the backbone of a country, it really runs deep in me. And it stirs up a lot of feelings. And I feel like the least we can do is talk about it with our kids, all this kind of stuff. So when the script came along, it really, on some level, got me. And I feel like so much of the stuff happening in this country is because people refuse to look at it, talk about it, unpack it, or all they do is talk about it, but from a place where you're looking down on it.
No, absolutely. And your character, Erika Jensen, was key in bringing down these cops. Tell us a little bit about Jensen the flautist.
Oh, God. That was what I was scared of the most, by the way, is playing the goddamn flute. You know, I got to talk to Erika. It was like an FBI headquarter approved, recorded conversation, you know, confidential. But I got to talk to her and we got along swell. We talked for an hour on the phone. And I did ask her, like, you didn't really play the flute, like as a hobby. And she was like, well, I actually studied it at Juilliard when I was 8. And I was like, fuck,
Shit.
God damn it. But I talked to her like maybe 2 weeks into shooting. So I already started down the road. And then talking to her really, really put me on like, not a different track, but like reminded me of what she did, what her work was about, you know, no bells and whistles. It was a lot of tedious, banal note-taking, listening, staying on a case for years and years and trying to do the right thing, trying to keep that goal in sight. And talking to her, we talked about being a woman in the FBI and all that, but really we talked about the work, what the work entails. So yeah, it was all about the work for her, you know, no high heels, no makeup, hair in a pony every day and coming into the office. And so we talked a lot about that with her too. And I was also interested in like how she was in the room and all those interrogation rooms, because 90% of the stuff I shot was like in sets that were like dreary, dank rooms, just me and Don Harvey, you know. And I wanted to like stay away from like the cops or the female cops or the FBI agents who like lean across the desk and they're like, tell me the goddamn truth, you know. Because it wasn't written like that, thank God. But you know, so I was curious, like, what was your body language like? Do you have mannerisms? How much in your face did you show when you were getting frustrated? Like, was your voice low? When were you still, you know, stuff like that? And she was like, okay. You know, I said, maybe that's a dumb question, but like, I feel like if I can capture the way you physically were in the room, because how we physically are in a room belies what's going on inside or not. So I thought that was a way to kind of tap into what she was doing.
I mean, that's a great way to do research, because when you're working on a project that is based on a true story, and there's some things obviously that we weren't able to recreate, but this is probably as nonfiction as a miniseries can be as possible. So you have to ask those questions and you want to capture that authenticity. How did the real Jensen respond to that, to you asking those kinds of questions in regards to what face did you make? Or did you ever lean across the table and say, book 'em, Dano? Like,
right. She was game. First of all, she was like, I'll never watch this show. You know, she's like behind the scenes. And so we talked about even simple things like she wore men's shoes when she was in the FBI. She said anything that like allowed me to physically be more comfortable, do my job better, that's what I did, So my hair was always up. I didn't bother with makeup. Like I never wore jewelry because you never wear jewelry that can be snagged or whatever. So little things like that were super interesting to me because all the FBI agents, well, not all, but most that I've seen on film or at least network TV are really kind of dolled up. Even their like clean look is still kind of coiffed, I did tell her like, well, this is HBO and it is a drama. So I might have to put on a pair of pumps at some point. But in a way, it was interesting because when she started telling me, there are days where like I had to like kind of read the room, read who was sitting in front of me. Because what you want is to get whoever's sitting across from you to tell you the truth. And you want to either catch them in a lie or remind them of something and how much information of what you're feeling in that moment can you reveal, right? So she said there were times where I was completely still, where I knew if I made eye contact, I was sending a message. And it was almost like she was, in a weird way, acting.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, maybe what you and I do is not so different.
Yeah, no, it's a big performance piece, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So Jensen gets to peel back layers that reveal how corrupt the Baltimore City Police Department actually is. And I know how you grew up and how you saw police as one of the factors in why you took the project. But I wonder, in current times, did you have like a perspective on inner city policing?
It's just something that's ingrained in me. Even in, pretty Montclair where I live, if a cop car passes me by, I tense up. I wish it would change. I don't know. I think it's that growing up in a country where my paternal grandfather was beaten to death by cops. It was a month after I was born, so my dad was really young, and it kind of changed the trajectory. He was a boxer when he was a teenager, like kind of a rebel without a cause. And his dad was kind of politically active in the underground, and he was waiting online at the butcher shop for food. Back then we had like ration cards and the economy was just shit, and he was waiting in line and started kind of like a mini, not riot, I would say, but like there were militia cars all around and they got up and, started pummeling him with bats and beat him to death. And my dad had to go identify his body when he was like 22. So from then, that changed my dad's life, right? That's when he started getting involved in kind of changing what was happening in Poland and being an activist and being what he turned out to be. And so that kind of is like in me. But my point is, I hate when people say, well, one bad apple doesn't spoil the whatever. What was that saying? Because I'm going to hold you to a higher standard of humanity.
Absolutely.
We're ingrained to think you serve and protect me. And if you fail to do that in your position, that I'm going to think you're like the worst kind of asshole. So I'm going to hold every cop to a higher standard. I'm not going to say, well, it's okay. It was just one cop. And it's also not just one cop, okay?
It's a fucking lot of them. Also, it's a bad system.
Yeah. Well, like in the show, yeah.
Yeah, it's a system that rewards you for not doing the right thing. You were talking about being a woman inside the police department and what that looked like. That industry is still dominated by men. It's very sexist, but we see that Jensen has the ability and the talent and the skill set to be able to disrupt and bring down some of the worst police officers of all time. Do you think that this kind of storytelling will help people abandon that old way of thinking?
You always hope so, right? Anytime you see a character in a position or holding a job or that you usually don't associate that field with, then I'd like to think that it opens someone's mind up a little bit or like dispels the myth of that. And I talked to the real Jensen about it. And she said she never looked at herself as someone who, she said, obviously it's a male dominated field. They started letting women into the FBI in 1972, right? That's like yesterday. She said, I'd never looked at myself as a female FBI agent, just as an FBI agent. And that is how I carried myself. And I didn't want to prove my femininity or disprove it. I just was who I was, and I was there to do my job. And in that way, maybe somehow I proved to the men around me that I belonged there. But I didn't lead with that. And so, it takes a certain kind of strong woman to just not give a shit and be there to do her job. She didn't have time for that. She didn't have time to be treated like a girl doing a boy's job because she was doing her job. She found a place within herself that was like, fuck that. I'm just going to walk in here like I belong.
It's the only way you'll really be able to get things done. You can't get caught up in the politics or how other people try to perceive you. You just go in there and be the best at what you do. In the perfect world, what do you want viewers of this to take away?
That this country owes it to itself to have really difficult conversations, to go back into the past, to reflect on it, to talk about it. You know, I want someone to watch this show who comes from a family of cops or has racists in his family and decides to strike up a conversation, right? It's the least thing that people can do in positions of power, people who haven't experienced discrimination or bias or prejudice, to start a dialogue, at the very least, to start to examine what they do, what they don't do, to be curious about how other people in this country live day in and day out. That's what I would hope for, at least.
I hope so, too. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for talking to me, Dee.
Our next guest is an excellent journalist who has covered criminal justice, arts, and culture in Baltimore for The Guardian and Baltimore City Paper, and he's the co-author of I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad. Baynard Woods, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Dee.
You have some experiences living in some different places, and the first thing I want to ask you is this the most dysfunctional police department you've ever seen in all your travels?
So we were careful in that subtitle to say police squad because I think there probably are more corrupt police departments, perhaps, like the LA Sheriff's Department right now, which is full of gangs. And I lived in Albuquerque for a while, and their police department is kind of rivaling BPD in terms of some of their problems. But
wait, we're not winning? BPD?
But that is the thing BPD is, just today, another $3 million settlement went through, this time to business owners that they failed to protect from the uprising. And so we're just constantly paying out. But what was so unique about this group was that everyone had their own criminal side hustle.
So I consider you, along with Brandon, experts on this case, right? I Got a Monster, the book you guys co-wrote together, is an extremely deep take on the Gun Trace Task Force, which the world is going to be learning about a whole lot once this show airs on HBO. One thing that has bothered me, and I'm curious to get your take on it, is the amount of people who haven't heard of this case. How does that happen?
Yeah, it was one of the reasons that we decided to write this book on it. I covered for The Guardian, I covered all of the trials of the cops charged with killing Freddie Gray from gavel to gavel. And every news outlet in the country had people filling that courtroom. And ultimately, it was a very important trials, but they were ultimately very boring as trials because it was all of the questions were essentially, were you trained to hook a seatbelt? You had to go through and prove in every case that they were not following training by not strapping him in. This trial, it was big bags of cocaine flying out of windows and exploding on the street, looting looters during the uprising and coming back to Donnie Stepp's house with trash bags full of drugs, dressing as a mailman to sneak into drug dealers' houses to steal drugs. It was just crazy stuff, and no one paid any attention at all. And I think it's one of the big problems with the way that the national news narrative works. After Freddie Gray was killed, that felt like the big narrative to all of the big outlets, whereas at this point, Trump was the only story anyone was interested in, and they didn't have the imagination to show that this is exactly the kind of thing. Wayne Jenkins is the perfect Trumpist police officer, but they couldn't bring that together, and so they just ignored the story.
How difficult was it to get victims to talk, to let you know what happened to them?
Some people were desperate to tell their stories, and others, it did take some convincing, trying to build long relationships over time. One of the things that we've both done as reporters have never been the kind of parachute reporter who will write a story and then not be involved anymore. And so we kept in touch with people and kept being in touch with them. And many of them wanted to talk and many didn't, or would tell us things off the record, but didn't want their names in there. And that also was perfectly fine. Like, we didn't want to re-traumatize anybody. We didn't want to make them relive these worst events of their lives. And, you know, the sad reality is that there were so many victims. It wasn't hard to find people that were desperate for someone to listen to their story. You know, like Jamal and Javon Walker had been trying to get someone to listen to their story since 2010. And so they didn't mind at all. They were more than ready to tell their story.
Jamal and Javon Walker still didn't get their money back. The Baltimore City Police Department, years later, like, we're coming up on a decade. I mean, full transparency, I knew Jamal since we were kids and knew Javon since we were babies. I knew them forever. And I remember after Jenkins stole his money, he walked around looking physically ill. And, you know, he's a stand-up guy. He's a talented electrician and a great person. So he took care of his family and he took care of business. But you shouldn't have to piece your family back together because an officer wanted to have a night of fun. And I think that's the part that we just don't see enough. We don't see that other side. We're not seeing the human side of it enough. And we just have to promote that more, because that's what I think we need to really bring the story home.
Yeah, I mean, and not only did they have to deal with the fallout of that, which so many people did, when they said that they would pull up on people and rob them 50 times a night. Maurice Ward, one of the cops, testified to that. That's 50 people a night who lose money or drugs and have to answer to someone for that. And, you know, one guy, Davon Robinson, who they stole $10,000 from, someone who he owed money to followed him home from his court date and then killed him in front of his daughter. He didn't have that money to pay from the money that was stolen. Jamal and Javon, fortunately, that didn't disrupt their lives in such a bad way, but Jenkins wouldn't let it go either. He pulled up in his car and would sit in front of their house months, years later. He would text them from fake numbers years later, and they were able to trace it back to him. He kept trying to terrorize them and make that terror ruin their lives long after they were still, you know, had recouped the money and had moved on, not from the police, but just earning it back.
This whole story that we're focusing on, Gun Trace Task Force, overlaps with the killing of Freddie Gray, right? And the uprisings that followed. And I remember you just being on the ground, covering protests, covering everything that was happening in the city, just being all over the place. I know your sneakers got a lot of miles during that particular time because you was everywhere. So take us back to that time and what the city was like.
It was such an amazing moment. The first words of this book, If I Got a Monster, are Baltimore almost had a revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think if we saw that happening anywhere else, we would frame it that way. But seeing it happening here, the news didn't want to frame it that way. I wanted to frame it as riots and other terms. The police, I think, work by the same logic as white people do. Police of whatever race and white people expect to be protected by the law, but not bound by the law, and expect everyone else to be bound by the law and not protected by the law. And that's exactly what you saw in the city at that time, that the uprising was saying, you can't just use the law as a force against us and not give us any legal protections. And you can't just for yourselves have all of the legal protections and none of the legal consequences. And so there was a way in which the uprising was both against police and, by being against police, was against the white power structure itself as well.
Well, you saw that when the city was in curfew and you have police officers in black neighborhoods with tanks and National Guard and forcing people to go in the house. But if you go to some of the hot spots like Fed Hill, there were like a bunch of white people partying as if like nothing was happening. And I think that's like just like it kind of ties together what you said in the most perfect way, which also presents the biggest problem in policing. You treat one group one way and you treat another group a different way. So now we're in this one of the most polarizing times that I can ever imagine, right? Not even just with race, but with all of these different issues. Now you have to be pro-cop or anti-cop. So I ask you, what does nuance look like in that conversation? Is there any room for it at all?
I'm not sure that I've ever been known for my nuance on policing in particular. I do tend towards abolition as an idea, but I am friends with a number of people who either are or have been in law enforcement, in the same way that I'm friends with people who have been incarcerated. And I don't necessarily approve of what my friends who are cops do as cops, but I can understand where they're coming from as people, in that, like in this city, the only economy is the drug war. I've become more and more convinced that there's no legitimate economy whatsoever between the police force taking all of our budgetary funds and then all of the other funds coming up through the drug trade. I don't know. And you see that so clearly in the case of Gondo and his friends, one of the cops who was indicted and ended up turning witness. He and his friend Kyle Wells both came up and just went to the different sides of the war, but neither of them had any great, especially Gondo, didn't have great ideological connection to the police. It was just a better gang that he could join. And so I do think that that's the nuance, is looking at the economic reality that forces this to be the economy of a city like this, that ties it all up with policing and the drug trade.
Abolition is a dream. It's something that so many of us believe in. It's something that so many of us want to see, but we also have to acknowledge that we live in the world now. What should be in the conversation based on what we have to deal with now? Because people are still going to jail every day. People are still dealing with these cops every day. Somebody's getting the shit kicked out of them by a police officer right now. So what kind of language do we bring into the conversation based on what's happening now?
I've covered prosecutors a lot, and you hear people say, well, there's no such thing as a progressive prosecutor. But if you read Emily Bazelon's book, Charged, you see that, yeah, there's maybe no such thing as a progressive prosecutor, but it's a world of difference to get 20 years for something and to get 5 years for something. That is very, very real. And the only way that you can really dismiss that is from a position where you're pretty confident you are never going to be sitting in that chair listening to a prosecutor ask for 20. And so I do think that there are real needs to take steps. Abolition obviously can't just happen with the stroke of a pen. And so it's constant agitation and constant steps. But I do think Baltimore is ahead of the rest of the country because we had these reform efforts after the death of Freddie Gray. And we've seen that's exactly what the Gun Trace Task Force was, and what Wayne Jenkins realized and weaponized was he made a counterinsurgency, essentially. I think of what the Gun Trace Task Force was doing is as a counterinsurgency against all of the reforms that had been passed and using those reforms to his own ends. So people say, oh, body cameras will fix everything. Well, before they even had body cameras, they were using their own cameras to film because they could set it up how they wanted. They could make it film what they wanted to film. So they break into a safe and fake film themselves breaking into it a second time to cover up the $100,000 they stole from it. So every technique of reform can also be used by the police against the people. It's really a brutal system at heart that has to be changed, but ultimately has to be abolished because they will figure out how to weaponize any reform that we bring.
I think getting rid of traffic stops was a great conversation that just went away. I think disarming is something that people could talk about more, because I grew up in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in one of the most dangerous cities. And in my life, I've never seen a cop pull up and say, hey, D. Watkins, stand in the corner. I'll take care of this. And then pull out his gun or her gun and save the day. They always pull up after the body's on the ground. They always pull up after whatever, the robber's running down the street with a bag of goods. They never pull up before it happens. They react. They react to what's happening. And I just feel like, with that being said, I don't think all cops should have guns. Maybe we take guns away from 80% of the police department and we replace them with what? $50 Under Armour gift cards. I don't know.
I saw you tweeting about that the other day, and I've been thinking about it. And I do think the cure violence model that Safe Streets here is based on, a lot of other ceasefire type programs in other cities are based on. The model is that violence spreads like a virus, and violence is transmitted that way. And the thing we have to realize is that if we're going to say that guns are violence, that armed cops are violent. And so when you send them into a community, that violence is going to spread. And so I think there is really something to that idea of disarming police on the way towards disbanding.
So based on your experience over a decade, do you feel like most of the big media outlets are covering police in the appropriate way?
No, not at all. I can hardly think of one big media outlet that is covering police in anything close to a proper way. The New York Times, within this last year, has run so many scaremongering stories about crime increase, and not even looking or thinking about what really constitutes crime, what is a crime, the way that police should respond to it. It's always more police. For so long, the problem with reporters and news outlets is they value institutions. If it's on a police report, they can't get sued, essentially. So they say, according to police, and they'll run that. But if they listen to someone in the community, they're worried about the police being upset. So if you're a person who's been abused by the police, the level of evidence you have to present to a reporter to even get anything in the paper is like head high. And if you are reporting on a police report and what the police say happened, the evidence that you have to have is ankle high. It's just like such a different world. In the Keith Davis Jr. case, there was a man shot right after the uprising here, only days after the charges had been brought against the officers who killed Freddie Gray, and protest had sort of calmed down, was shot at 43 times. And immediately the stories were he shot at police. That turned out to not be true at all. There's never been a retraction of those stories. There's never been any kind of, there have been follow-ups, but there would definitely have been apologies if someone said, police shot at me, and that turned out not to be true. It would be a huge, huge ordeal. That reporter would probably be fired. All kinds of things would happen, and that doesn't happen if you report lies that the police tell you or lies that prosecutors tell you. And there are some magazines that will run features and stuff by really good reporters that are able to tackle it in better ways. But for the most part, our conversation around policing is naive and innocent at best, and dishonest and disingenuous and sucking up to power at worst.
Where do we go from here? What's a big next step we can take forward? Because we see the problems in policing, we see the problems in reporting. What should we be doing across the board?
More reporting is really important, and more reporting on the ground. But I do think that white people really are the problem with this. And we need to really understand that the way that policing works in this country is an apartheid system. And the only way that that apartheid system can be broken down when it comes to policing is to try to start breaking it down in other ways. And that's why, like, immediately I'm finishing this book, I started my next book, which really digs into those issues and trying to figure out what this apartheid system that we're living in is and how I contribute to it, how I inherited it, how it affects me. But, you know, it is also discouraging. I have to say that after finishing this, there was a huge amount of depression that comes from the most important story I think I ever wrote was about a guy, Tyree Woodson, who in 2014, the police said he shot himself in the head in the Southwest Precinct police station bathroom, and that he snuck a gun into the station in a medical boot. And he was such a bad BGF guy, Black Guerrilla Family gang guy, that he went in the bathroom and shot himself in the head. And almost everything about their story turned out to be false. It turned out that the police officer who wrote the report about his death had written false, almost exactly Wayne Jenkins-like charges against him a year earlier. He'd waited a year in jail for trial, ended up with another charge from defending himself in jail, but is acquitted on all charges from that. Shortly after getting out on that other charge, ends up in the police station to be questioned and ends up dead in the bathroom. And I talked to his mother every year. He died on August 5th. I continue to talk to her at least then every year. And his fiance. And I think about how many of those people there are who still no one has listened to their story, who still, it took me years and years and years to report it. And how do we have enough people to report on the huge amount of misconduct that's going on every day? We saw with this story, we had to limit the cases just tremendously because there were so many victims, so many cases that to the reader, it gets boring if it's just another robbery. So how do we keep that from happening in our minds, from thinking, oh, just another robbery, oh, just another, and then turning and looking at the next tweet or whatever.
Baynard Woods, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the official We Own This City podcast, and a special thank you to our guests, George Pelecanos, David Simon, Baynard Woods, and Dagmara Domińczyk. We Own This City airs on HBO Monday nights, and our next episode comes out on May 23rd. See you then.
This is the official We Own This City companion podcast, hosted by D. Watkins, and it's a production of HBO and Pineapple Street Studios. Our senior producer is Emmanuel Hapsis. Our consulting producer is Carrie Untholas. Maria Robbins Somerville is our associate producer. Aaron Kelly is our managing producer. And our engineer is Hannes Brown. Our executive producers are Gabrielle Lewis, Barry Finkel, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Production music is courtesy of HBO. And you can watch episodes of We Own This City on HBO Max. Until next time.